I tried to learn Spanish and Italian at the same time, but I remember getting completely confused because whatever I would learn in Spanish would be just overwritten by the Italian. Welcome back to the Story Learning Podcast. This is episode 2 of the new rebranded, refreshed Story Learning Podcast, which is the podcast to help you get motivation and tips to learn a new language to fluency, reach your goals and change your life. My name is Ollie Richards, and I'm still Ollie Richards even 10 years after I started this podcast. But unlike the original podcast, I'm now coming to you in video format as well. Isn't this great? So if you're listening to this on audio, on Spotify or your favorite podcast player, you can also find this on YouTube, and Spotify should also have a video if we manage to figure out how to do that. So that is awesome. The format of this show moving forward is going to be answering your questions. So please do leave your questions in comments on YouTube videos, questions on Spotify, or you can even email it into us as well at ollie@storylearning.com. We're on the lookout for your questions. And the question we're going to talk about today is one of probably the most common questions that I get about language learning, and that is, can you study 2 languages at 2 different levels, or can I study 2 languages at the same time? And this question comes from Victor. Now, Victor asks, I'm trying to figure out the best way to tackle 2 languages at the same time. Is it better to dedicate specific days to each language or combine them in the same day? Also, my levels are wildly different at the moment, complete beginner in French and high intermediate in European Portuguese. So this question, should you learn 2 languages at the same time? I think the circumstances really, really matter here. And there are a few different variables that would change the way that I answer this question. So one variable is, are you a beginner in both languages? So are you trying to learn French and German at the same time from scratch? That's one situation. A different situation would be that you are already quite competent in one language. Let's say you're upper intermediate in German, but you want to start learning another language like French from scratch. Like how does that change? And the other variable here is how close the 2 languages are. So for example, if you are learning Spanish and Italian, 2 very similar languages at the same time, that's quite different to learning Spanish and Mandarin Chinese at the same time. So what's going on here? Well, let me tell you a couple of quick stories about my experience learning 2 languages, because for the most part, for all the languages that I've learned over the last 20 years, I have not learned 2 languages at the same time, and I've been quite deliberate about that. So let me tell you some experience I did have with that. So I remember in the early days, I'd learned Spanish and I got quite good at Spanish, and then I went off to Brazil and I learned Brazilian Portuguese. Now, when I was in Brazil, I was completely immersed in Portuguese. I was hanging out with famous musicians and going to samba schools and traveling the country. I was like living and breathing Portuguese. I didn't even speak English for most of the time I was there. So I came back from Brazil, back to the UK, and I was speaking pretty good Brazilian Portuguese at that point. I was very, very confident. And then I remember going down to a bar where we used to play samba. And in the group where we would play samba, I had lots of friends from South America, but Spanish-speaking countries. So I remember turning up to this bar, and I would see my Brazilian friends and say hi to them. And then my Spanish-speaking friends would come up and say hi to me in Spanish, and I would reply to them in Portuguese. And I was like, "Whoa, what's going on?" And I couldn't remember how to speak Spanish. It was really weird. It was like I'd had this language I was super good at already, just 6 months before, and I was now in this situation where someone was talking to me in Spanish and I could barely reply. I would reply in Portuguese. And I thought, that's a problem. Like, I don't want this to happen. And so what happened over the next few months was I went out quite a lot, which is what tended to happen in those days. And I would be hanging around with Brazilians, and so Portuguese and Spanish speakers. And I would practice switching between those 2 languages. So I'd speak Brazilian Portuguese to the Brazilians and Spanish to the other Latin Americans. And after a few months, I could do it. I'd managed to parse apart those languages in my mind, and it's almost like I had a Spanish identity and a Brazilian Portuguese identity, and I could switch between them. Almost like a persona, like a character that I could turn a dial, and I would become this different person. And I remember exactly how it would work, right? I would adopt this, I'd have like a little personality shift, right? A little bit like the Incredible Hulk. I would just in a split second, I would flick a switch in my mind, I would transform into this different persona, and the persona in my mind would be attached to the language, and that's how I navigated it. So after being back for a few months, I could, at this point, switch effortlessly in between Portuguese and Spanish, and I got to say, it was very cool, and I impressed a lot of people by doing that. But here's the thing. The only reason I was able to do that was A, because I'd spent 3 months actually really practicing that switching, but B, I'd learned these languages sequentially. So I did not learn Spanish and Portuguese at the same time. Rather, I learned Spanish for a year or two, got really good at it. And then I went to learn Brazilian Portuguese, got really good at it. And then after that, I combined the two. And that I think is absolutely critical because each language has got its own nuance. And this is the big problem with learning two very similar languages at the same time. There was a time before I remember I tried to learn French and Italian, or it might even mean Spanish and Italian at the same time. It wasn't a particularly serious project, but I remember getting completely confused because whatever I would learn in Spanish would be just overwritten by the Italian that I learned because it would just be so close. And so this is why I would say if you're going to learn two languages at the same time, it's much better if they are very different from each other. So it would be far preferable to learn, say, Spanish and Cantonese or Spanish and Korean, because there's at least no danger of one language stepping on the other language's toes. Right? So if you learn the word for iPad, well, actually, iPad is going to be the same in any language. If you learn the word for book in Spanish and then you learn the word book in Korean, they're going to be completely different. And so, yeah, you've still got double the amounts of stuff to learn because you've got to learn it in Spanish and Korean, but at least you're not going to have this danger of the two words being so close to each other that your brain just gets really confused. Okay. So in order of hierarchy, I'd say the thing that you really don't want to do is learn two very similar languages at the same time. It would be better to learn two very different languages at the same time, but it would be even better than that to learn two languages at the same time when you're already really good at one. And this I have done. So generally, so I would say there's a threshold for when you learn a language and then you don't forget it. And that threshold is around the upper intermediate level, B2 on the Common European Framework. If you can get to B2 in a language, which means you comfortably pass what I call the pub test, meaning that you can go for a drink in a pub with someone that you don't know and talk comfortably in that language without the other person having to really try hard to accommodate you linguistically. Both of you can enjoy the conversation, you can have a good time and do it all in that language. You don't have to be perfect, but the feeling between you has to be comfortable. That's B2, that's upper intermediate right there. Now, if you reach that level in a new language, you can effectively stop studying it and you won't forget it. You might get a bit rusty, but you're never going to completely forget it because at that level, what happens is that your neural pathways just own the language. There's something that happens in your brain, and I'm not a scientist, so I can't explain this technically, but it's like the language has got hardwired into your brain and you just won't forget it. So what I would do in that situation, which sounds actually for Victor, who said you are high intermediate in European Portuguese, it sounds like this might be your situation. In which case, what I would say is, I would just put your European Portuguese on maintenance mode and then turn all your attention to French, which you said is at a complete beginner level. Specifically, here's what I'd do. I would probably stop studying Portuguese, or your strong language, almost entirely at this point. And I would just use it naturally. So I would go and I would watch movies. I would go and hang out with friends. I would travel to the country and just use it naturally. But I'm not in study mode at this point. I mean, just let's use the language mode. Let's just listen to it. Let's speak it. Let's hang out with friends. Because this is what you want to be doing over the long term. If you think to yourself, what are the next 20, 30 years of language learning look like for me? The ultimate goal is to be able to just know the languages and use them as part of your life. That's why we learn languages. It's not for the satisfaction or the reward ultimately, although that's cool. It's to actually use them to improve our lives and live richer lives. And what that looks like is just using those languages, speaking those languages, making friends, living a real life in those languages. And so if you're already at a high intermediate level in Portuguese, that's the time when you want to just start doing that right now. Now, what this will do is this will make space for you then to start to learn French as a complete beginner. And I would devote my entire time to just studying French as if the Portuguese didn't exist. You're not going to lose the Portuguese. Again, it might get a bit rusty and you might get a little bit confused here and there. But importantly, I would say if you do start to get words confused in your Portuguese, don't worry, because if it's at that high level, you're not going to forget it. And even if things do get a little bit funky from time to time, you're always going to be able to go back and relearn it very quickly. I guarantee you will not lose it. But the benefit of focusing just on the French or your new beginner language is that language learning is a direct consequence of focus. The more you focus, the more you learn, which is why I'm saying that it's best to give your full focus and your full attention to French at this point, because you stand a better chance of just focusing on it and learning and getting good at the language, right? It's that exposure, it's that focus that's going to help you. Just like in the story I told you about me going to Brazil and learning Portuguese, I was so focused during those 6-9 months that I got really good at the language. And that was what enabled me later to learn to use Spanish and Portuguese together at the same time, because I knew and I understood and I felt what it meant to speak that language really, really well. Now, some people ask, how should you manage the study time? Like, should you do one day on one language and one day on the next, or should you do 2 languages in one day? You know, it's very difficult to be specific here. And I think anyone who gives any opinion on something of this level of detail, they're just talking from personal experience. So again, what I would say is ideally do not study 2 languages from the beginning or actively study 2 languages at the same time. Ideally, you'd get one to a very good level and then use it, live it, integrate it into your life, and then turn your full attention to studying the new language. I think that's by far the better way of doing it. But then if you are learning both 2 languages at the same time, then I think the only thing I would say is do as much as you can to keep them completely separate. If you're studying 2 languages on the same day, your brain's going to get confused. So I would separate them either by days or even by weeks. So week 1 is French, week 2 is Portuguese, week 3 is French, week 4 is Portuguese, or something like that. And the more you can separate them in your own mind, the easier it's going to be. And the other option you've got, if you already know another language to a good level, is to use that language to learn another language. So in the case of Victor, when he speaks really good Portuguese, but he wants to learn French, you can buy a French textbook written in Portuguese. So a book for Portuguese people to learn French. That way you're going to be actually using that one language to learn another. And sometimes it can really help, because if you talk about a French concept in Portuguese, the concepts are very easily transferable. Sometimes coming from English, we have to use all kinds of like mental acrobatics to understand a new concept, right? But if that concept also exists in Portuguese, then it's easier to read about that concept in Portuguese to learn it in French, if you see what I mean. So this is a concept that's called laddering. If you go way back through the podcast, you will find entire episodes on that. But look, with all of this said, I'm responding to this question on the basis that the question is like, what is the optimal, most efficient way to learn a language quickly? So you should listen to everything I've just said if your goal is to be as efficient and fast and quick as possible. But look, there's a bigger thing at play here, which is that, as a very famous linguist once said, a language is the only thing in the world worth knowing badly. And so if the question instead is it okay if I study 2, 3, 4 languages because I love languages and I just want to learn and have fun? Then the answer is go for your life. I don't want to ever tell anyone not to do anything in a language. If you are enjoying it, if you think it's fun, if you want to learn and you want to just immerse yourself and have fun with 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 languages at the same time, go for it. Knock yourself out. I think it's a fantastic thing to do. Just be aware that by doing that, you are probably going to be learning less optimally than you otherwise could. But, I got to say, the older that I get, the more I tend to think that endless optimization is not really the recipe for happiness. So do with that what you will. If you'd like a resource to help you with planning your language learning, which is really what this comes down to, learning two languages at the same time, then you might like to download my free language goal planner. What this does is it's just a very convenient printable worksheet that allows you to track the resources that you are using to learn so you can stay consistent, and it can also help you measure your progress and just define your goals. So there's nothing here that you won't have heard of before, but it's just one very convenient place to keep that all organized and stay honest with yourself. Ollie, how do I get the language goal planner? I'm glad you asked. Link in the description of the video or the podcast, depending on where you are watching this. And please remember, if you are watching this on YouTube, then by all means subscribe to the channel and subscribe to the podcast as well. And if you're listening to this on a podcast, please hit subscribe. Feel free to leave a review on your platform of choice. Those are always very welcome. And go over and subscribe to the YouTube channel as well, because then you get to see stuff when I hold it up, like this gorgeous book right here. That's it for now. I'll see you back in the next episode of the podcast.